The cold steel of a handgun pressed against my daughter's forehead is an image that will be burned into my retinas until the day I die. It started as a Tuesday, a mundane, overcast Tuesday where the biggest stressor in my life was a passive-aggressive email from the HOA president, Brenda, about the unauthorized shade of beige I'd used on my flower pots. Before we dive into this nightmare of power, corruption, and the ultimate betrayal of trust, comment below which country you are watching from. It's a story that proves no matter where you live, some people think they are untouchable. I was sitting in the school pickup line, listening to a podcast and checking my mirrors when I saw the commotion near the side entrance of the high school. Students were scattering like birds from a gunshot, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror, and my heart didn't just skip a beat, it stopped entirely. I saw my daughter Maya backed against a brick wall, her hands trembling in the air, while Brenda's son, Tyler, stood 2 feet away with a black semi-automatic leveled at her chest. Brenda had always been the neighborhood Karen, a woman who treated our gated community like her own private fiefdom and her son like a crown prince who could do no wrong. She spent her weekends measuring grass height with a literal ruler, and her weekdays making life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her whims, but I never thought her toxicity would bleed into something this violent. I didn't think, I just moved, throwing my car into park and sprinting toward the school gate, my boots hitting the pavement with a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed the pounding in my skull. The air felt heavy, smelling of damp asphalt and the metallic tang of fear that seemed to radiate off the crowd of paralyzed teenagers watching from the sidelines. Tyler's face was twisted into a sneer of entitlement, a look he had clearly inherited from his mother, as he shouted something about Maya disrespecting his family's legacy in the hallway. I could hear the distant wail of sirens, but they felt a lifetime away, and all I could see was the finger of a privileged, angry boy tightening on a trigger. I reached the perimeter, but a group of school resource officers held me back, their grips like iron as I screamed my daughter's name until my throat felt like it was bleeding. "That's my child!" I roared, the sound tearing through the sudden, eerie silence that had fallen over the courtyard as Tyler stepped closer to her, the barrel of the gun now inches from her eyes. Maya was sobbing silently, her tears carving tracks through the light dusting of freckles on her cheeks, her gaze locked onto the weapon that threatened to end her world. Just then, a black SUV roared over the curb, narrowly missing a group of students, and Brenda stepped out, looking not like a worried mother but like a woman about to demand a manager. She didn't look at the gun in her son's hand with horror. She looked at the police officers with a condescending smirk as if they were nothing more than an inconvenience to her afternoon. "Lower your weapons," she shouted at the officers who had their guns drawn on Tyler, her voice shrill and commanding. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's on his way, and you'll all be looking for new jobs by sunset." The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a knife, a suffocating blanket of dread that made it hard to draw a full breath. I watched in disbelief as Brenda walked right past the police line, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete, and stood next to her son, patting his shoulder as if he'd just won a track meet instead of holding a girl hostage. "He's just defending his honor," she told the lead officer, her eyes cold and blue like glacial ice, completely ignoring the fact that my daughter was seconds away from being a statistic. I felt a surge of white-hot rage that momentarily eclipsed my fear, a primal instinct to protect my own at any cost, even against a woman who believed her husband's badge gave her son a license to kill. The sirens grew louder, a cacophony of howling electronics that signaled the arrival of something much bigger than the local police department, but the terror only intensified. I saw the flash of movement at the end of the block, a line of armored vehicles, dark and imposing, tearing through the school zone with a purpose that felt ominous rather than helpful. The arrival of the SWAT team didn't bring the relief I expected. Instead, it felt like the world was collapsing under the weight of tactical gear and high-caliber rifles. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as the back doors of the lead van swung open and men in full combat gear spilled out, their movements synchronized and lethal. At the head of the formation was a man I recognized from the framed photos in Brenda's hallway, Sheriff Miller, Brenda's husband and the man who held the keys to the county's justice system. He didn't look like a peacekeeper. He looked like a warlord, his face obscured by a tactical mask, his eyes scanning the scene with a cold, calculating intensity that made my blood run cold. He didn't order his men to disarm Tyler. Instead, they formed a perimeter that seemed to shield the boy and his mother, pushing the school officers and the frantic parents back even further. The air was filled with the scent of diesel exhaust and the sharp, ozone smell of heavy electronics, a sensory overload that made the entire scene feel like a fever dream. I watched in horror as Sheriff Miller walked toward his son, but instead of the firm hand of a lawman, he gave a subtle nod that sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd of witnesses. "Secure the area," he barked into his radio, his voice a gravelly command that echoed off the school's brick walls, and suddenly the SWAT team's rifles weren't pointed at the boy with the gun. They were pointed at us, at the parents, at the teachers, and most terrifyingly at the officers who had been trying to protect my daughter from the beginning. Brenda stood tall, her hand still resting on Tyler's arm, a triumphant glow in her eyes that told me this was exactly how she expected her world to function. She leaned in and whispered something to Tyler, and for a moment the boy's grip on the gun loosened, but he didn't lower it. He just shifted his aim toward the crowd. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that made it feel like the very foundations of the law were crumbling right in front of me. "Is this a joke?" I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation as I tried to break past the line of armored men only to be shoved back by a gloved hand. "Your son has a gun pointed at my daughter. Do your job." The sheriff finally looked at me, and the utter lack of empathy in his gaze was more terrifying than the weapon itself. It was the look of a man who believed he was above the law he swore to uphold. He didn't say a word to me. He just adjusted his tactical vest and turned back to his wife, sharing a brief silent communication that spoke volumes about the depth of their corruption. The crowd behind me began to murmur, a low growl of collective outrage that started to swell as people realized the rescue was actually a cover-up in progress. Students were filming on their phones, their hands shaking, capturing the moment the thin blue line turned into a wall of protection for a violent, privileged teenager. I could see the sweat beads on the back of the local officers' necks. They were caught between their duty to protect and the terrifying authority of the man who ran their department. The standoff stretched into an agonizing eternity, every second feeling like a minute, every minute like an hour, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the courtyard. Maya's legs finally gave out and she collapsed to her knees, her eyes never leaving Tyler's face, which had transformed from a sneer into a mask of confused, adrenaline-fueled panic. He was realizing that he had started something he couldn't stop, but with his parents acting as his personal army, he felt emboldened to keep the weapon raised. The sound of a helicopter began to throb in the distance, a heavy, rhythmic beating that felt like it was vibrating in my very bones, adding to the chaotic symphony of the afternoon. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was the school principal, her face pale and her lips drawn into a thin line of pure fury as she watched the abuse of power unfolding. We were witnesses to a crime, but the criminals were wearing the uniforms of our protectors, and the realization that no one was coming to save us was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. The silence that followed the arrival of the state police was deafening, a sudden vacuum of sound that sucked the air right out of the courtyard as 30 black and white cruisers swarmed the school. It turns out, several teachers hadn't just called 911, they had called the governor's office and the State Bureau of Investigation, reporting a hostage situation and a rogue sheriff simultaneously. The SWAT team members, seeing the overwhelming numbers and the high-ranking officials stepping out of the cars, began to slowly lower their rifles, the realization of their precarious position finally sinking in. Sheriff Miller's face went from a mask of cold authority to a pale, sweating mess as he realized his jurisdiction ended where the state's began, and his private army was melting away. A high-ranking colonel stepped forward, his uniform crisp and his expression like granite, and he didn't even look at Brenda as he ordered his men to disarm Tyler immediately. The boy, finally realizing that his father's badge wasn't a magic shield anymore, dropped the gun as if it had turned white-hot, the metal clattering against the pavement with a final, echoing ring. I didn't wait for permission. I broke through the now faltering line of SWAT officers and sprinted toward Maya, catching her as she collapsed into a heap of sobbing, terrified relief. I held her so tight I was afraid I'd break her, the scent of her shampoo mixing with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cold air of the afternoon. Behind us, the scene descended into a different kind of chaos, not of violence but of accountability, as the state police began zip-tying the hands of the very men who had been threatening us minutes before. Brenda was screaming, her voice a shrill, ugly sound that tore through the air, claiming her rights were being violated while she was being led away in handcuffs. The sheriff tried to pull rank one last time, his voice booming with a false bravado that fooled no one, but the colonel simply handed him a folder containing a warrant for his arrest. It wasn't just about today, the investigation had been building for months, and Tyler's outburst had merely provided the catalyst to bring the entire corrupt house of cards crashing down. The aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, depositions, and the slow, painful process of healing, as the community struggled to reconcile the betrayal of trust they had witnessed. Tyler was charged as an adult with multiple counts of aggravated assault and kidnapping, his honor replaced by a prison jumpsuit and a permanent record that no HOA influence could erase. Sheriff Miller and Brenda were indicted on charges ranging from official misconduct and obstruction of justice to witness intimidation. Their faces splashed across every news outlet as the Karen and the corrupt cop. Our neighborhood changed overnight. The HOA was disbanded and replaced by a board that actually cared about safety and community rather than the color of flower pots or the height of the grass. Maya began therapy, and while the nightmares didn't go away immediately, she found strength in knowing that her mother and her community had stood up when the world turned upside down. We learned that true power doesn't come from a badge or a title, but from the collective voice of people who refuse to be silenced by bullies in any form. Standing on our porch months later, the beige pots now a vibrant, defiant red, I looked at my daughter and realized that justice isn't always swift, but it is inevitable when the light is finally shown into the dark corners of corruption. We no longer look over our shoulders when we walk through the neighborhood, and the heavy silence of fear has been replaced by the normal, beautiful sounds of children playing and neighbors talking. The moral of this story is that authority without integrity is nothing more than a mask for cowardice, and trust is a fragile thing that, once broken by those in power, can never truly be mended. If you believe that no one is above the law and that every child deserves to feel safe in their school, hit that like button and share the story to spread the word about accountability. What would you have done if you were in my shoes, watching the people meant to protect you turn their guns on the innocent? Leave a comment below and remember, honor is earned through action, not granted by a title or a badge.